We all know the story of how the US became the world's financial superpower, but today, almost every country on Earth is drowning in debt. Some because of their own mistakes, others because of secret deals, economic warfare, and outright financial sabotage. Some nations borrowed willingly, but others were forced into impossible debt traps that they can never escape. Each country has a story just as shocking as the 2008 financial crash, but these stories are rarely told. We're going to get through the full timeline of how countries around the world fell into massive debt, who was really behind it, and why they can never pay it back. Some nations, like the US, print money endlessly, while others, like Argentina, have collapsed under the weight of repeated defaults. But they all have one thing in common: debt controls them more than they control their own economies. The story begins in 1789. As George Washington was sworn in as the first US president, America was already drowning in debt. The country owed $75 million, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to roughly 40% of the nation's GDP. To put that into perspective, that would be like the US owing over $10 trillion today, adjusted for scale. The debt came from the Revolutionary War, where the US had borrowed heavily from France, the Netherlands, and private banks to fund its fight for independence. But this wasn't just a matter of numbers. Much of the debt was short-term, high-interest loans that were quickly coming due, and foreign creditors, especially France and Dutch banks, were expecting repayment fast. But the young US government had a problem. It didn't have enough money to pay back these loans outright. Some of the most powerful voices in the new government feared that debt would become America's greatest weakness. One of them was Thomas Jefferson, who saw debt not just as an economic issue, but as a threat to democracy itself. He famously wrote, "To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." Jefferson feared that borrowing would lead to a system where banks, foreign powers, and wealthy elites would hold too much control over the government. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, saw debt as a tool, not a burden. His plan was simple: America would never truly pay off its debt. Instead, it would borrow, invest, and grow the economy so that the debt became smaller relative to the country's wealth. Hamilton pushed for the federal government to assume the war debts of all 13 states, consolidating them into one national debt. This led to fierce opposition, as southern states like Virginia had already paid off much of their own debt and didn't want to be responsible for the borrowing of northern states like Massachusetts. In 1790, a compromise was reached. The US government would absorb all state debts, but in exchange, the nation's capital would be moved to the south to what would become Washington, D.C. But the debt problem wasn't solved. It was just getting started. By the early 1800s, the US was still struggling to manage its growing debt. Then another war changed everything. The War of 1812, a second conflict between the US and Britain, was supposed to be a short, decisive war. Instead, it dragged on for years, draining the government's finances. By 1815, the war had left the US owing over $120 million. To keep up with payments, the government had to issue bonds, raise tariffs, and rely on more borrowing from foreign creditors. By the time peace was restored, one thing had become clear: America's debt wasn't going away. But it was nothing compared to the financial hole Britain, the country that once occupied it, was now digging. Unlike the US, which was a young nation still finding its economic footing, Britain was already the most powerful nation on Earth. Its empire stretched across North America, the Caribbean, India, and beyond. But that power came at a cost. To maintain control over its vast territories and fund its never-ending wars, Britain had borrowed on a scale far greater than any other nation in history. At the start of the 19th century, Britain found itself in a fight for survival. The Napoleonic Wars were the most expensive set of conflicts in British history at the time, costing over 1 billion British pounds, an unprecedented sum in the 1800s. The government had to borrow some money than the entire economy was worth, pushing national debt beyond 200% of GDP, one of the highest debt levels ever recorded. To fund the war, Britain had to get creative. For the first time, the government started selling bonds, essentially promising to pay investors back later with interest. Wealthy businessmen and banks poured money into the war effort, betting that Britain would win. At the same time, a powerful banking network led by the Rothschild family helped Britain secure massive international loans, keeping its war machine running even when funds were running low. And to squeeze even more money out of its own people, Britain introduced something new: income tax. In 1815, Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo, and Britain emerged as the dominant superpower of the 19th century. But while Napoleon was gone, the debt remained. After the war, Britain was left with a massive problem. Paying off the debt was becoming harder than running the entire country. Nearly half of all government revenue was going straight to interest payments. The government had two options: cut spending and risk revolt, or find a new way to bring in money. Britain chose the second option. Rather than paying off its own debt, Britain exported it. The British government and its banks started lending money to other nations, trapping them in financial dependence. London became the financial capital of the world, pumping money into Latin America, India, and Africa. Debt had become Britain's new weapon. And in 1824, fresh off of its independence from Spain, Argentina saw an opportunity. It needed money to build its economy, and Britain, now the world's financial capital, was more than willing to lend it. At first, the deal seemed like a turning point for Argentina. A massive loan from British banks meant funding for infrastructure, railways, and modernization. But there was a problem. Most of that money never even made it into Argentina's economy. The loan was managed by Baring Brothers, a powerful British bank that took enormous fees. By the time Argentina actually received the funds, much of it had already been lost to middlemen, administrative costs, and corruption. Even worse, the government wasn't ready to spend it wisely. Instead of investing in long-term growth, much of the money was wasted on luxury imports, military spending, and short-term projects that didn't generate revenue. Then, in 1825, disaster struck. Britain itself fell into a financial crisis, setting off a chain reaction across its foreign investments. By 1827, Argentina defaulted. It simply couldn't pay back what it owed. But defaulting didn't make the debt disappear. Instead, it gave British banks even more control. British investors saw Argentina as a financial risk and raised interest rates, making future borrowing even more expensive. Foreign companies started buying up Argentina's infrastructure, taking control of its railroads, ports, and banks. Argentina had fought for independence from Spain, but now it was financially tied to Britain. Over the next few decades, Argentina was forced to borrow again and again just to keep the economy running. And every time it did, Britain's grip on the country tightened. But Argentina wasn't the only nation caught in the cycle of borrowing and collapse. Thousands of miles away, a global superpower would soon face its own financial disaster, not from loans taken, but from the crushing cost of war. That nation was France, and after a devastating defeat at the hands of Prussia, it would learn firsthand how debt could bring even the most powerful empires to their knees. France, confident in its military strength, expected a quick victory. Instead, it suffered a humiliating defeat. The French army was crushed, and Paris itself was besieged. But the real blow wasn't just military, it was financial. After the war, the newly unified German Empire demanded an enormous price for peace: 5 billion francs in war reparations, equivalent to over $1 billion at the time, an astronomical sum for any nation. France had no choice but to borrow. The government issued bonds, raised taxes, and sought international loans to cover the reparations. And in just 3 years, the French people had paid the debt in full. But the damage was done. To keep the economy afloat, France leaned on its colonial empire. Loans were extended to countries across North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. In exchange for financial support, France demanded access to resources, trade advantages, and political influence. For the colonies, the price of borrowing was often economic dependence and political control. France quickly realized that debt wasn't just a burden, it was a weapon. It used loans to extend its influence across the globe, especially in its colonies. Local governments in places like Algeria, Vietnam, and West Africa were forced to take on loans from French banks, binding them to Paris's financial system. By the early 20th century, France's role as a global lender had backfired. As World War I approached, France was still carrying the weight of its past debts. The financial strain from reparations, colonial campaigns, and economic mismanagement left the country vulnerable. When war finally came, France had no choice but to borrow again, this time on a scale even larger than before. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Its territory stretched from the Balkans to North America and the Middle East, but decades of military defeats, corruption, and political instability had left its economy in ruins. The empire needed money to modernize and survive, but instead of reforming its economy, the Ottomans turned to European loans, and that's where the real problems began. In 1854, during the Crimean War, the Ottomans took out their first major foreign loan from European banks, primarily from Britain and France. At first, the money seemed like a lifeline. It funded new railroads, military upgrades, and infrastructure projects aimed at bringing the empire into the modern age. By the 1870s, the Ottoman Empire was drowning in debt. Interest payments consumed a huge portion of the government revenue, and the economy couldn't keep up with repayments. The empire tried to borrow more just to pay off its existing loans, but that only made the situation worse. In 1875, the inevitable happened. The Ottoman Empire defaulted on its debt. Defaulting wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a political one. European creditors demanded repayment and took direct control of the empire's finances. A special organization called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established in 1881. It was a foreign-run institution that took over the collection of taxes from key sectors like tobacco, salt, and alcohol. In effect, the Ottomans had lost control of their own economy. Foreign powers, especially Britain, France, and Germany, now had the final say over how the empire's money was spent. The Ottoman government had become a puppet in its own territory, forced to prioritize debt repayment over the needs of its people. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shell of its former self. World War I would be the final blow, but the cracks had already formed decades earlier, caused not by foreign armies, but by foreign banks. What made the Ottoman Empire collapse so significant wasn't just the size of its debt, it was how debt became a tool of foreign control. Britain, France, and Germany didn't need to invade the Ottoman Empire with armies. Instead, they conquered it through financial dependence. Russia, a vast empire spanning 2 continents, had survived wars, rebellions, and economic hardship for centuries. But in the early 1900s, debt would become the silent force that helped bring down the Tsarist regime and pave the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. For most of the 19th century, Russia was desperate to catch up with the industrial powers of Western Europe. Unlike Britain, France, or Germany, Russia was still largely a feudal society. Its economy was based on agriculture, and much of its population lived in poverty. To modernize, the Russian government began borrowing heavily from European lenders. Railways, factories, and military expansions were all funded with foreign loans, particularly from France and Britain. The cracks began to show during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Russia believed victory would be easy, but Japan's modern military humiliated the Russian forces. The war wasn't just a military defeat, it was a financial catastrophe. Russia borrowed heavily to fund the war, expecting to repay the loans with resources from new territorial gains. Instead, the defeat left Russia deeper in debt, and the empire's economy took a massive hit. By 1914, Russia was on the brink of collapse. But then came World War I. The Russian government, already drowning in debt, borrowed even more to fund its war effort against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war pushed the empire's debt to unsustainable levels. By 1917, the Russian people had reached their breaking point. The economy was in freefall, and debt repayments were swallowing what little money the government had left. The result was a full-scale revolution. By March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending centuries of imperial rule. Just months later, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution. One of the Bolsheviks' first actions was to cancel all foreign debts. In 1918, Lenin issued a decree repudiating all loans taken out by the Tsarist regime, effectively declaring that Russia would no longer pay back a single ruble to foreign creditors. The Russian debt crisis had become an international disaster, but for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the move was symbolic. Russia's new government refused to be chained by the debts of the old empire. But while Russia was wiping out its debts with revolution, another nation, Germany, was about to drown in a debt crisis of its own, one that would lead to hyperinflation, economic ruin, and the rise of one of history's darkest regimes. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War I, but for Germany, the war's true cost was just the beginning. As part of the treaty, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war and pay enormous reparations to the Allies allied powers, mainly France, Britain, and Belgium. The bill was staggering: 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. The German government had no choice but to sign the treaty. The plan was to repay the debt through taxes, industrial production, and foreign loans, but Germany's economy had already been shattered by the war, and the reparations were set so high that even basic repayments seemed impossible. With no way to meet its obligations, the German government turned to a dangerous solution: printing money. The idea was simple: if Germany couldn't earn enough money to pay its debts, it would create the money it needed. But this strategy came with devastating consequences. Between 1921 and 1923, the German currency, the mark, lost nearly all its value. Prices skyrocketed, and wages couldn't keep up. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 soared to 200 billion marks by late 1923. Families carted around wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy groceries. When Germany defaulted on its payments in 1923, France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. They seized coal, steel, and raw materials to cover the missed payments, further crippling Germany's economy. In 1924, international dealers intervened with the Dawes Plan, restructuring Germany's debt and allowing it to borrow money from the United States to stabilize the economy. Inflation was brought under control, and Germany's economy briefly recovered throughout the late 1920s. But the debt wasn't gone, it was just delayed. And in 1929, disaster struck again with the Great Depression. The US called in its loans, and Germany's fragile economy collapsed for a second time. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and fear that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. Hitler promised to end reparations, rebuild the economy, and restore German pride. By 1933, he was appointed chancellor, and soon after, he canceled Germany's remaining debt payments altogether. But the world would soon learn that Germany's attempt to escape debt wouldn't bring peace. It would lead to the deadliest conflict in human history: World War II. The fear of another economic collapse would shape international policies for decades, leading to the creation of institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank after World War II. But while Germany's debt crisis was a lesson in what happens when punishment goes too far, another country, Greece, would face a very different kind of debt disaster nearly a century later, triggered not by war, but by reckless spending and a financial system stacked against them. Greece's financial troubles began long before it joined the European Union. For decades, the country has struggled with economic mismanagement, high inflation, and political instability. But things seemed to change in 2001 when Greece adopted the euro as its official currency. The switch to the euro allowed Greece to borrow money at much lower interest rates. European banks, especially in Germany and France, were eager to lend, believing that Greece was now a stable part of the European financial system. The Greek government took full advantage, borrowing billions to fund infrastructure projects, public sector jobs, and social programs. For years, Greece used creative accounting to mask its rising debt levels, even working with major international banks like Goldman Sachs to hide billions in loans. Official reports made the economy look stable, but in reality, the country was spiraling toward financial disaster. By 2009, the truth came out. Greece's budget deficit was revealed to be 12.7% of its GDP, more than 4 times higher than what the European Union allowed. Panic spread through global markets, and the cost of borrowing for Greece skyrocketed overnight. The problem wasn't just Greece's debt, it was how connected it was to the rest of Europe. Major banks in Germany and France held billions in Greek bonds. If Greece defaulted, it wouldn't just crash its own economy, it could trigger a financial crisis across the entire Eurozone. In 2010, Greece received its first bailout package from the European Union and International Monetary Fund, a staggering 110 billion euro loan. But the bailout came with harsh conditions. Severe austerity measures were imposed, including tax hikes, pension cuts, and slashed public spending. Unemployment soared to over 27%. For ordinary Greeks, the bailout felt less like a rescue and more like a punishment. Meanwhile, much of the bailout money didn't even stay in Greece. It was funneled back to the European banks that had loaned Greece the money in the first place. To many, it felt like the country was trapped in a cycle of debt repayment that would never end. By 2015, Greece had received 2 more bailout packages totaling 246 billion euros, the largest financial rescue in global history at the time. But despite all the aid, the economy was still in freefall. In July 2015, Greece did the unthinkable. It defaulted on a payment to the International Monetary Fund, becoming the first developed country to ever do so. For ordinary Greeks, Greeks, the human toll of the crisis was devastating. Suicide rates surged as poverty deepened and homelessness doubled in major cities like Athens. A generation of young Greeks left the country in search of work abroad, triggering a brain drain that weakened the economy even further. Greece's debt crisis wasn't just a national tragedy. It exposed the deep flaws in the European Union's financial system. The strict austerity measures imposed by wealthier nations like Germany deepened Greece's suffering without offering a real solution. The crisis also sparked a wave of political upheaval across Europe, fueling the rise of populist movements and shaking confidence in the EU itself. While Greece has since exited its bailout programs, it remains weighed down by debt, still owing more than 300 billion euros today. But while Greece's crisis exposed the dangers of borrowing in a globalized world, another country, Japan, would show what happens when debt doesn't lead to collapse, but becomes a permanent way of life. Japan has taken a completely different path. Despite having the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the world, over 260%, Japan has managed to avoid default, hyperinflation, or economic ruin. Japan's debt crisis didn't begin with reckless borrowing or government corruption. It began with a boom. In the 1980s, Japan's economy was one of the fastest growing in the world. Real estate prices skyrocketed, the stock market surged, and Japan seemed destined to overtake the United States as the world's top economy. But by 1991, the bubble burst. Real estate prices collapsed and the stock market lost nearly half of its value in just 2 years. Banks were left with trillions of yen in bad loans, and consumer confidence disappeared almost overnight. Instead of allowing banks and businesses to fail, the Japanese government stepped in, borrowing heavily to keep the economy afloat. It poured money into infrastructure projects, bailed out failing banks, and kept interest rates near zero. The hope was that by spending its way out of the crisis, Japan could reignite growth. That growth never came. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Japan's economy stagnated. Despite massive government spending, growth remained weak, wages stagnated, and deflation set in. A dangerous cycle where prices keep falling, discouraging spending and investment. To keep the economy from collapsing entirely, Japan borrowed even more. By the early 2000s, the country's debt had soared past 100% of GDP. But unlike Greece or Argentina, Japan didn't default. The question is, why? The secret to Japan's survival lies in where the debt comes from. Unlike most heavily indebted countries, over 90% of Japan's debt is owed by its own citizens, not foreign banks or international leaders. Japanese individuals, businesses, and institutions buy government bonds, keeping the money circulating within the national economy. Interest rates have remained near zero for decades, making it incredibly cheap for the government to borrow. At the same time, Japan's central bank has taken extraordinary steps to stabilize the economy, even buying up massive amounts of government debt through a policy known as quantitative easing. And culturally, Japan has a high level of trust in its financial institutions. People continue to save and invest in government bonds, believing that the state will eventually repay its debts no matter how large they become. While Japan's debt hasn't caused an outright economic collapse, it has taken a toll on society. An aging population and shrinking workforce have left the country struggling with labor shortages and rising healthcare costs. The result is a demographic time bomb that could eventually strain the government's ability to repay its debts, no matter how stable the system seems today. For now, Japan's debt remains manageable, but the future is uncertain. If interest rates rise or the public loses confidence in the government's ability to repay its obligations, the economy could spiral into crisis. Yet, despite its enormous debt, Japan remains one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations on Earth. Its ability to borrow without collapse has baffled economists for decades, challenging the idea that high debt automatically leads to economic disaster. But the one thing all these nations have in common is that debt controls them more than they control it. It shapes economies, topples governments, and redraws the map of global power. And the story isn't over. Today, global debt is higher than it's ever been. As governments continue to borrow trillions to fuel their economies, the question isn't whether another crisis will happen, it's when. And when it does, the world will once again learn the lesson that history keeps repeating. No empire, no nation, and no economy can outrun its debt forever. Subscribe.